This is my true story. I gave my son everything I had, my money, my time, my life. I thought when I grew old, he would give me respect. But one night, after shouting at me, he dragged me outside like trash and locked the door behind me. He looked me in the eyes and said, "This isn't your house anymore." The pain cut deeper than any wound, but I didn't cry. I stayed silent. Because you won't believe what I did next. Before that, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. And please subscribe so more people can hear my story. I was not born with wealth in my hands. I was born with nothing but calloused palms and a back strong enough to carry the weight of life. From the day my son came into this world, I swore he would never live the way I did. I swore he would never know hunger, never know cold, never know what it felt like to be without. So I worked. I worked until my hands split open, until my body ached so deeply I thought I might break. I worked through sickness. I worked through storms. I worked through every season of life because my only thought was him. Every sunrise was not for me. It was for him. Every coin I earned, every dollar I saved, it all went toward his future. I remember long days when I left home before dawn, the sky still black, and returned after nightfall when the stars had already filled the sky. My boots carried the dust of fields, factories, and endless jobs. I carried bricks, I lifted steel, I bent my back under loads that would crush a weaker man. And when I came home tired, sweaty, broken, I looked at his face and told myself it was worth it. When he was young, I carried him in my arms, pressing his small body against my chest to keep him warm in winter. When he was older, I carried him on my shoulders so he could see the world above the crowd. When he wanted toys, I bought them. When he wanted school books, I found the money. Even if it meant I went without food. I paid for his schooling, every fee, every uniform, every book. I made sure he never sat in class ashamed of being poor. I gave him cars when he grew older, paying not just for the metal itself, but for the insurance, the repairs, the fuel that carried him wherever he wanted to go. When debts came, I paid them. When trouble came, I solved it. I even gave him the roof over his head, the very house he locked me out of. I built it, not with my words, but with my sweat, with my hands, with my body. Every corner of that house is stained with my sacrifice. I believed that by giving him everything, he would grow to honor me. I believed respect would come as naturally as breathing. I told myself this sacrifice would not be in vain. That one day, when my legs were too weak to walk, he would carry me the way I once carried him. That when my hands trembled, he would steady them. That when my birthdays came, he would stand by me with love. I thought the cycle of care would return to me. I thought blood was enough to bind gratitude to a son's heart. So I gave him not just my labor, not just my money, but my entire life. And I never asked for anything in return but respect. I even placed his name on the bank accounts. I trusted him completely. I told myself, "This is my son. He will protect me. He will never betray me." I was blind to the truth. I did not see that every dollar I gave him, every gift I bought him, every sacrifice I made was feeding his arrogance, not his love. I thought I was building his future. I was building his pride instead. He looked at me not as a father to be honored, but as a man who would always give, who would never take, who would never leave. He mistook my sacrifice for weakness. He mistook my silence for surrender. Still, I kept going. I swallowed every sharp word he spoke, hoping he would change. I endured his coldness, thinking it was temporary. I told myself love cannot vanish. But I was wrong. My sacrifice became his entitlement. My gifts became his expectations. And in the end, my son did not see me as the man who gave him everything. He saw me as a man who owed him everything. That was the wound that cut deepest of all. Because I gave him my life, and he gave me nothing but disrespect in return. At first it was small. That is how cruelty begins. It does not arrive like a storm. It creeps in like a shadow. When he was younger, he would greet me at the door, smile, ask how my day had been. But as he grew older, those greetings turned into silence. He walked past me as though I were invisible. When I asked him small questions, "Did you eat?" or "How was work?" He answered with short words, sharp and impatient. At first, I told myself it was stress, the pressure of life, the burden of youth trying to become a man. I excused it because I wanted to believe the love between us was still strong. But deep inside, I felt the shift. The warmth I once saw in his eyes began to vanish. Respect became impatience. Gratitude became annoyance. If I asked him for help, even something small like lifting a chair or bringing me water, his sighs were heavy, his tone sharp. "Do it yourself," he muttered once, and it cut me deeper than any knife. My hands trembled from age, my legs were weak, yet he looked at me as if my needs were a burden. I remembered carrying him in my arms when he was too weak to stand, but when my strength faded, he did not return the care. He looked at me as though I were dead weight dragging down his life. I tried to ignore it. I told myself, this is a phase. He will remember who I am to him. But the signs grew clearer. At family dinners, he mocked my shaking hands when I spilled a little water. He rolled his eyes when I asked him to repeat something because my ears could not hear well. Once, when I coughed at the table, he pushed back his chair and snapped, "Do you have to ruin every meal?" Those words broke something in me, because once upon a time, he sat in that same seat as a boy, coughing, and I would rush to bring him medicine, water, comfort. I never complained. I never mocked. I only gave. Neighbors began to notice. Relatives began to whisper. They saw how he spoke to me, how his tone carried no respect. They saw me remain silent, swallowing my pride, hoping to protect his name. Because even as he insulted me, I carried shame for him. I did not want the world to know the truth, that my son was becoming cruel. I protected him even as he destroyed me. That is what fathers do. We take the blows in silence, hoping love will come back. But love never came back. The first time he raised his voice, it echoed through the walls like thunder. It was not the voice of a son speaking to a father. It was the voice of a master speaking to a servant. "Why are you always in my way?" he shouted. "Why do you keep asking for things?" The words burned because I had spent my whole life giving him everything. I was never in his way. I was the reason he had a way at all. Without me, he would have had no path, no roof, no life. But he spoke as if I were nothing, and in his eyes I saw not love. I saw contempt. Still, I remained silent. I thought patience could fix him. I thought my silence would teach him humility. But my silence only fed his arrogance. He grew bolder, his insults sharper, his respect thinner. He mocked my age, called me slow, called me useless. He looked at me not as a father, but as a burden. And every time I endured it, he believed he was right. Every time I stayed quiet, he believed I was weak. But I was not weak. I was waiting. And though I did not know it yet, every cruel word he spoke was building the fire that would one day burn away his arrogance forever. It happened on a night I will never forget. The sky outside was heavy with clouds, and the air inside the house was heavier with his anger. The day had been quiet, but with him, quiet was always dangerous. He carried storms inside him now, and I could feel one building as he moved around the house, slamming doors, muttering curses. I tried to stay in my corner, silent, hoping the storm would pass. But storms do not pass when cruelty is in control. They break. And that night, it broke over me. I asked him something simple, something no father should ever fear to ask. I asked if he could lower his voice. My ears, old and tired, could not bear the shouting. That was all. But my words struck him like fire. His eyes turned sharp and his face twisted with rage. He stood up from his chair and came toward me, his steps heavy, his body stiff with anger. Before I could move, before I could even take a breath, he grabbed my arm. His fingers dug into my skin, not like a son holding his father, but like a man dragging garbage to the street. My body, weak with age, could not resist. He pulled me from my chair, his grip strong, his heart colder than I had ever known. I stumbled as he yanked me toward the door. My legs shook, my ribs still sore from past insults turned to blows, but he showed no care. To him, I was not a father. I was an object in his way. He dragged me across the floor, my feet barely able to keep balance. Memories hit me as he pulled me. Memories of the times I carried him when he was too weak to walk, when storms outside roared, and I held him close so the thunder would not scare him. I remembered wrapping him in blankets, telling him he was safe in my arms. And now, those same arms of mine were being gripped, twisted, and used to throw me out of the home I built. When we reached the door, he flung it open with force. The night air rushed in, cold and sharp against my face. He pushed me out like a man tossing out trash. I stumbled onto the porch, my knees nearly giving way. I turned back, my heart breaking, my eyes searching for even the smallest sign of regret in his face. But there was none. His eyes were hard, his voice colder than the night wind. "This isn't your house anymore," he said. Then the door slammed. The sound echoed through the darkness, final and brutal. I reached for the handle, but the lock clicked. My own son had locked me out of the house I built, the house my sweat had paid for, the house where every wall carried my sacrifice. I stood there, staring at the wood that separated me from the life I had created, and I realized in that moment I was no longer a father to him. I was nothing. The night was cold, and I shivered in the air. My body ached, but the pain in my chest was worse. It was not the cold that froze me. It was the truth. My son had dragged me out like a stranger, like a beggar, like a burden. The same boy I once carried through storms had left me in the storm alone. I pressed my hand against the locked door, and all I could hear was silence on the other side. No footsteps, no apologies, just silence. I stood there for what felt like hours, the darkness pressing down, the humiliation burning in my veins. My heart whispered questions I could not answer. How could blood turn so cold? How could love turn to hatred? How could the boy I gave everything to throw me out as though I had never mattered? There were no answers, only silence, only the locked door, only the night. And that was the cruel act, not just the dragging, not just the shove, not just the slam of the door. It was the message behind it. He was telling me I was nothing. He was telling me I had no place in the home I built. He was telling me my sacrifices were forgotten, my love erased, my life worthless. That night, he killed the last hope I had for his respect. That night, as I stood outside in the dark, I realized my son had chosen cruelty over blood, and that realization would change everything. I stood there in the night air, the cold cutting into my bones like knives. The door behind me was locked, the house dark, and the silence louder than any scream. My body shook, not just from the chill of the wind, but from the weight of what had been done to me. I pressed my hand against the wooden door, hoping somehow it would open again, hoping somehow his heart would soften, but nothing moved. The handle stayed firm, the lock stayed shut, and his cruelty stayed final. My own son had dragged me outside and left me to stand like a beggar in the cold. That was not just an action, that was a sentence, a judgment, a punishment meant to humiliate me. I looked up at the night sky. The clouds moved slowly, covering the stars, and the air felt heavy with rain. I remembered all the nights when storms came, when thunder rolled and lightning flashed, and I carried him in my arms so he would not be afraid. I remembered pulling him close, wrapping blankets around his tiny body, whispering in his ear that he was safe as long as I was near. I stood guard by his bed through fevers, through cries, through every shiver of fear. My arms were always his shelter, my presence always his warmth. And now, years later, I was the one left in the cold, shivering, trembling, with no one to cover me. The son I once protected had turned into the man who left me exposed to the same storms I once shielded him from. The porch felt like a cage. The walls of the house rose behind me like a fortress I was no longer welcome in. I paced slowly, my legs heavy, my ribs aching, but there was nowhere to go. My dignity felt stripped from me. Every time the wind blew harder, it was like a reminder of his words. "This isn't your house anymore." Those words cut through me again and again, like knives sharper than the cold. My mind replayed the moment. His hand gripping my arm, his voice cold, the slam of the door, the click of the lock. Each detail carved itself into my memory like a scar that would never fade. I sat on the steps, my hands trembling, my heart heavy. I thought of the neighbors. What if they saw me? What if they looked out their windows and saw the man who built this house sitting outside like a stray dog? Shame burned in me deeper than the cold. I thought of the relatives who might hear of this, who might whisper about how a father had been thrown out by his son. The humiliation was heavier than the night air. I lowered my head and tried to breathe, but every breath felt broken, every thought filled with sorrow. But even in that humiliation, a strange fire began to spark inside me. The more I remembered carrying him through storms, feeding him when I was hungry, sheltering him when I had no shelter for myself, the more I realized the depth of his betrayal. The humiliation was real, yes. The pain was sharp, yes. But beneath it, something else was forming. A fire. A quiet fire. The kind that does not roar, but smolders, steady and unyielding. My silence that night was not weakness. My silence was the beginning of something he could not imagine. He thought locking me out stripped me of power. But in truth, it revealed the truth. He had mistaken comfort for ownership. He thought the house was his. He thought the money was his. But he had forgotten where it all came from. And as I sat in the cold, humiliated and broken, I began to remember something he had forgotten too. The night dragged on, and I did not sleep. I stayed on those steps, the wood hard beneath me, the air biting my skin. I closed my eyes, and memories came like waves. His first steps, his first words, his first school uniform. I had been there for it all. And now, in return, he had dragged me out like trash. The pain was sharp, but in that pain, I found clarity. If he saw me as nothing, then I would show him the truth. I would remind him who built the life he stood on, not with fists, not with words, but with silence, with action, with power he forgot I still had. That night, as I sat outside shivering, humiliated, stripped of dignity, I made a vow in my heart. This humiliation would not be the end of me. It would be the beginning of his downfall. He thought he had locked me out, but in reality, he had opened the door to his own ruin. He thought when he dragged me outside, when he slammed the door and locked it, that he had ended me. He thought his act of cruelty made me powerless. In his mind, I was nothing but an old man, standing in the night, weak and forgotten. But what he did not know, what he refused to see, was that the power he thought he owned still rested in my hands. He believed locking the door meant locking away my worth. He believed throwing me outside stripped me of everything. But he forgot something far greater. He forgot that the house he guarded with arrogance was built by me. He forgot that the money he spent so freely came from my savings. He forgot that every account, every dollar, every paper still carried my name. As I stood in the night air, humiliated, my hand pressed against the locked door, the truth returned to me like a flood. I remembered the long years of work, the endless hours of saving, the careful building of a fortune not for myself, but for him. My name was on the deeds, on the accounts, on the investments. My signature still had the power to open doors far greater than the one he had locked in my face. He thought he had left me with nothing. In reality, he had left himself with nothing. Because while he mocked me, while he cursed me, while he treated me as a burden, the truth was simple. He lived on what I built. He survived on what I provided. And with one decision, I could take it all back. He thought I was a beggar. He thought I was trapped. But the truth was clear. The man standing outside in the cold was still the owner of the warmth inside. The man shivering on the porch was still the one whose name sat above every account, whose hand still held the power of every dollar. He thought youth gave him power. He thought cruelty gave him control. But youth fades and cruelty collapses. True power lies in ownership, and ownership was still mine. I clenched my fists and remembered the details he had forgotten. The house was paid with my wages. The mortgage had been signed under my name. The joint accounts we shared, every cent had started from my hands. Even his car, the one he bragged about, carried my signature in its history. He strutted through life as if he was the master, but the truth was bitter. Without me, he was nothing. His arrogance was built on a foundation I created, and foundations do not forget their builders. That night, as the cold bit deeper into my bones, I realized he had made a grave mistake. By locking me out, he reminded me of everything still tied to me. He reminded me that the power he mocked was never gone. It was only sleeping. And now it was awake. I looked at my trembling hands. They were old, but they still worked. They still carried strength, not in muscle, but in memory, in signatures, in authority. My son believed that dragging me outside meant dragging me away from the life I built. But in truth, he had only dragged me closer to clarity. He thought I was nothing but an old man in the dark. But I was still the man with the power to turn off his lights forever. The cold night became a lesson. He thought the door separated us, but the truth was, it did not. The true door was money. The true door was ownership. The true lock was not the one on the house. It was the one on the accounts, and those keys, those locks, those doors were still mine. He had locked me out of the house, but I held the power to lock him out of life. And as I stood in the silence of that night, I began to plan. Not with rage, not with shouting, but with silence and patience. The same silence he mocked would now become the silence that stripped him of everything. He thought dragging me out was the end, but it was the beginning, because he had forgotten the truth. The man outside was still the owner inside. The man humiliated was still the man with the power. And soon he would learn what it means to be left with nothing. The night was long, and I sat outside in the darkness, my body weak but my mind sharper than it had been in years. My humiliation burned inside me, but it did not stay as humiliation. It began to change. It began to harden into something stronger. The spit, the shove, the locked door, all of it fed a fire in me. He thought he had ended me when he dragged me out like garbage. He thought he had silenced me with a slam of a door. But what he really did was awaken the man I once was, the man who worked, who built, who saved, who carried. And now that man was ready to act. I realized something clear that night. He had taught me what it felt like to be thrown away, to be left outside. And I would return that lesson to him, but in a way far deeper than he could ever imagine. He locked me out of the house. I would lock him out of his life. Not with words, not with hands, but with the very thing he relied on most: money. He thought the roof above his head gave him strength. He thought his car gave him freedom. He thought the food on his table proved his independence. But every single one of those things came from the money I earned. The accounts he accessed, the cards he used, the checks he signed. They were all possible because of me. He had forgotten that, and I decided he would remember. The decision came slowly, but once it was there, it settled in me like iron. I would not beg to be let back in. I would not argue. I would not raise my voice. I would not fight him with anger. Instead, I would fight him with silence and with power. The kind of power he thought I no longer had. I would go to the bank. I would take every dollar, every cent, every piece of wealth I had left in this world. I would move it into my hands alone. And when he awoke, when he walked into the bank with his arrogance, when he tried to spend as he always did, he would find nothing. He would find his accounts empty, his pride gone, his comfort stripped. He would learn what it means to stand outside in the cold with nothing, the same way he made me stand outside that night. I sat on the steps of the porch, the wood cold under me, and I thought of every insult he had thrown at me. You're a burden. You're useless. This isn't your house anymore. Each word pressed harder on my heart, but instead of breaking me, it steeled me. I whispered to myself, he will learn. He will learn that I am not weak. He will learn that I am not empty. He will learn that I still hold the power to take everything. That whisper became my vow, my decision. When morning came, I would not be the same man. I would not be the silent, humiliated father he thought he owned. I would be the man with the keys to his fate. I would be the man who took everything he thought he controlled. I would show him the cost of cruelty. I would show him that respect is not just owed, it is earned. And since he refused to earn it, he would live without it. He would live without me. He would live without money. He would live with nothing but the memory of what he had done. I lifted my head to the sky, the stars breaking through the clouds, and I felt calm for the first time that night. My body was still sore, my bones still cold, but my spirit was strong. The decision was made, and nothing could turn me back. He thought he was the one with power, but in truth, his cruelty had given me back mine. And in the silence of that night, I became something he would never expect. I became his reckoning. The sun had not yet fully risen when I stood from the porch steps. My body was stiff, my bones heavy, but my mind was clear. I brushed the dirt from my clothes, straightened my back as much as my age allowed, and walked into the morning air. I did not knock on the locked door behind me. I did not call his name. I left it all in silence, because silence was now my weapon. My feet carried me slowly down the road, each step steady, each step fueled by the fire that had grown inside me overnight. I was headed for one place only: the bank. The place where signatures speak louder than shouts, where quiet actions destroy arrogance more than fists ever could. When I arrived, the glass doors of the bank reflected my face back at me, old, tired, lined with years of labor. But behind those lines, behind those weary eyes, there was steel. The clerk looked up as I entered, polite but distant, as they always are. To them, I was just another old man with trembling hands. But they did not know what I carried with me. They did not know that in my pocket lay the power to end my son's comfort forever. I placed my documents on the counter, the accounts, the papers, all bearing my name. My voice was low, calm, steady. "I want to withdraw everything," I said. The clerk blinked, surprised, then looked at the numbers. Their eyes widened slightly, though they quickly tried to hide it. The accounts were not small. Decades of work, decades of savings, careful investments, all of it sat there waiting. It was not millions like the wealthy brag about, but it was enough to build a life, enough to destroy one. In total, $1.7 million. Money I had saved for family, for his future, for the legacy of my blood. Money I thought would protect him when I was gone. Now, it would protect me from him. The process was long, signatures needed, approvals required. But every time the pen touched paper, I felt strength returning to me. My hands trembled, but my writing was clear. My name still carried power. With each signature, I took back what was mine. With each form, I stripped him of his pride. The clerk asked once, softly, "Are you sure?" I looked them in the eye, and in my silence they understood. I was sure. I was more sure than I had ever been in my life. The bills, the checks, the transfers. It all moved from one side to the other. His side to mine. Our accounts to my account. His comfort to my security. With every dollar that moved, I thought of his words. "This isn't your house anymore." I thought of his hand on my arm, dragging me out like trash. I thought of the slam of the door, the click of the lock. And I smiled, not with joy, but with justice. Because now I was locking him out. Not of a door. Of his entire life. When the final papers were signed, when the clerk handed me the receipt, I felt lighter. Not because of the money in my control, but because of the weight I had lifted from my chest. He thought humiliation would end me, but humiliation had turned into power, power written in ink, power counted in bills, power silent and unstoppable. I left the bank with no fanfare, no noise. The world moved as normal, cars on the road, people walking. But in my heart, I knew something had shifted forever. I walked back slowly, the envelope heavy in my pocket, but my spirit steady. I did not go back to his house. That door was no longer mine to open. I did not call him to tell him what I had done. I wanted him to find out himself. I wanted him to walk into the bank with his arrogance, demand his money with his pride, and be met with silence and numbers that told him the truth. Zero. Nothing. Empty. That would be my revenge. That would be my justice. He thought dragging me outside and locking me out ended my story. But when I walked out of that bank, I knew the truth. It was only the beginning of the beginning of his downfall, the beginning of his shame, the beginning of a life without the comfort he never earned. And all of it would happen because I chose silence, because I chose not to fight with shouts, but with signatures. That morning, the sun broke through the clouds, and the light touched my face. For the first time in years, I felt free. Not because I had money in my pocket, but because I had taken back my dignity. I had taken back my life. He thought he locked me out forever. But in truth, I had locked him out instead. Locked him out of his accounts, locked him out of his comfort, locked him out of the arrogance he thought would last forever. And the beauty of it all was simple. I did it without a word. The news of what I had done did not reach him immediately. For a few days he lived as he always did, arrogant, careless, convinced that his strength and his money made him untouchable. He woke up in the house he believed was his, drove the car he believed he owned, and carried himself with the same pride that blinded him. But arrogance always collapses when truth arrives, and truth has no mercy for the cruel. His collapse began at the bank. He walked in with the same swagger I had seen 1,000 times, head high, voice loud, eyes filled with entitlement. He handed his card to the clerk, expecting everything to work as it always had. He expected to see numbers stacked in his account, proof of the fortune he thought was his. But instead, the screen told the truth. Balance, 0, nothing, empty. The clerk hesitated, unsure how to tell him, but eventually the words came out. There are no funds in this account. I was not there, but I can imagine it. I can imagine the way his face twisted, first in confusion, then in disbelief, then in anger. He shouted, demanded explanations, slammed his fist against the counter. "Check again," he must have barked. "You're wrong." But no matter how many times they checked, the truth did not change. The money was gone. Every dollar, every cent, every piece of wealth he thought untouchable had been stripped away in silence. He must have stormed out of the bank, his arrogance cracking, his pride bleeding. He went home, searched for documents, searched for answers, but the truth was waiting in every corner. The accounts were empty, the safety he relied on was gone, and in his chest he began to feel what I felt that night on the porch, cold, helpless, humiliated. Neighbors began to notice. Relatives began to whisper. The same ones who had seen him drag me outside, the same ones who had heard the slam of the door, now shook their heads at his downfall. They asked each other, how could a man throw out his father? How could he lock him outside in the cold? And now, as his fortune collapsed, they added another question. Is this his punishment? Shame began to spread around him like fire, and there was no water to put it out. Days turned into weeks, and his anger grew, but his options shrank. He tried to borrow, but no one trusted him. He tried to explain, but no one believed him. He tried to pretend, but everyone could see the truth. The house grew quiet, the car stayed parked, and his arrogance turned into silence. He was living the same silence he once mocked in me. But for him, silence was not peace. Silence was torment. Silence was the sound of his pride collapsing. I did not answer his calls. Yes, he called. Of course, he called. He shouted into the phone, demanded explanations, cursed my name. But I stayed silent. For every insult he ever gave me, my silence was the answer. For every shove, for every cruel word, my silence was his reply. He thought I would come running back, thought I would explain, thought I would undo what I had done. But I did not. I let the silence teach him what words never could. That cruelty has a cost, and he was now paying the full price. And so the man who once locked me out now found himself locked out too. Locked out of wealth, locked out of security, locked out of the future he thought was his. He thought dragging me outside had ended me. But in the end, it ended him. That was the fallout. Not just the empty accounts, not just the whispers, not just the shame. The true fallout was the mirror that showed him who he really was. A man who spit on the hand that fed him, and in return was left with nothing. After the accounts ran dry, after the truth spread, the world around him began to change. The man who once walked tall now walked with his head low. Relatives who once praised him now avoided him. Neighbors who once nodded in respect now whispered behind his back. The same people who saw him drag me out like trash, the same ones who shook their heads at his cruelty, now spoke openly about his downfall. A man who throws his father into the night, they said, cannot expect blessings to stay with him. His arrogance, once his shield, had become his curse. His name, once spoken with pride, now carried only shame. The house that once echoed with noise grew quiet. He no longer invited friends, no longer showed off what he had. The car sat unused, a reminder of what was lost. Bills piled up, and with no money to pay them, the walls of the home began to crack. He knocked on doors, asked for loans, begged for help, but no one trusted him. They remembered what he had done to me. They remembered how he treated his own blood. And no one helps a man who spits on his father. His cruelty had become a mark on his name, a stain that no excuse could wash away. I heard stories from others. How he shouted in frustration when the lights went out because the bills were unpaid. How he cursed when collectors came knocking, demanding what he no longer had. How he sat alone in silence, his pride broken, his future gone. Some pitied him, but I did not. Pity is for the innocent. He was not innocent. He was the architect of his own ruin. Every insult, every shove, every cruel word had built the prison he now lived in. And the walls of that prison were not made of bricks. They were made of shame. His phone calls kept coming at first. Angry, demanding, full of curses. Then they changed. His voice grew softer, desperate, begging. "Father, please," he said in the messages I never answered. "I need your help. Just a little money, just a chance." But I had heard enough from him in the past. When I asked for water, he mocked me. When I asked for patience, he spat on me. When I asked for space in the house I built, he dragged me outside. My silence was now my answer. His calls went unanswered. His cries found no ears. He was left to taste the same emptiness he once gave me. Neighbors who once envied his life now pointed at his ruin. "That's the one," they whispered. "That's the man who threw his father out." Children in the street laughed when he shouted at them, because even they knew he had no authority left. He was no longer feared. He was no longer respected. He was no longer a man of status. He was just a man, broken by his own cruelty, left with nothing but regret. I did not watch him fall. I did not need to. My silence had already sealed his fate. I lived my life away from him, free of his insults, free of his anger. But I knew, even without seeing, what he was enduring. Because I had endured it once, the cold, the silence, the humiliation. The difference was simple. I endured it with dignity. He endured it with shame. And that was the aftermath of his cruelty. The man who once dragged me outside was now dragged down by his own actions. The man who once locked the door behind me was now locked out of his own future. The man who once laughed at my weakness was now the one mocked by others. This was not fate. This was justice. This was the price of cruelty, collected in full. When I walked away from that house, I carried no suitcase, no belongings, only the clothes on my back and the silence in my heart. But I carried something far greater than any bag. I carried my dignity. And with every step away, I carried my justice. I did not raise my hand against him. I did not curse his name. I did not fight him with anger. I fought him with silence, with patience, with the very thing he never understood: control. He thought he had taken everything from me when he dragged me out, when he slammed the door, when he locked me in the night. But in truth, I still had everything, because everything he touched, everything he lived on, was built by me. And when I chose to take it back, I did so not with rage, but with calm certainty. That was my justice. I found a small place of my own, modest, but mine. A roof above me that I paid for myself. 4 walls that held peace instead of curses. A bed where I could lie down without fear of footsteps approaching to humiliate me. It was not a palace, but it was freedom. I cooked my own meals, simple and plain, and I ate them in silence. But this silence was different from the silence of his house. This silence was not heavy. This silence was not shame. This silence was peace. For the first time in years, I could breathe without chains on my chest. The money I withdrew, the $1.7 million that carried my name, I kept safe. Not for him, never for him, but for myself and for the life I would now live. Every dollar was not just currency, it was justice printed on paper. Every bill reminded me of the years I worked, the years I saved, the sacrifices I made. And every bill reminded me of the truth. He had mocked me, but he could never erase what I built. The accounts that once gave him comfort were now the very accounts that left him broken. That was not theft, that was justice. Because the money was always mine. He had only borrowed it under the roof of my silence. When he destroyed that silence with spit and cruelty, I took back what was mine. I heard the whispers of his downfall. How the neighbors pointed. How the relatives spoke. How he walked the streets no longer proud, but ashamed. Some said it was sad. Some said it was deserved. I did not answer them. I did not need to. My justice was not for their approval. My justice was for me. For the man who gave everything, who endured everything, who finally decided enough was enough. I did not seek revenge through fire or fists. I sought justice through absence, through action, through the quiet stripping away of everything he thought would last forever. And as for him, the son I once held in my arms, the son I once carried through storms, he was left with nothing but the storm of his own making. His house became a prison, his name became a curse, his pride became a chain. He once told me, "This isn't your house anymore." Now the world whispered back to him, "This isn't your life anymore." That was justice, not mine spoken, but his lived. Now, when I sit by my window in the evenings, I do not think of him with anger. I think of him with finality. My story with him is over. My silence has spoken. My justice is complete. I gave him everything, and he gave me cruelty. I took it back, and I gave myself peace. That is all that remains. Final thought. He dragged me outside and locked the door. He thought he buried me in humiliation. But I took every dollar, and I left him with nothing. And in that silence, I found my justice.